When trade becomes a switch, India's import ban on Pakistan and the architecture of modern power. In classical economic theory, trade is treated as a neutral mechanism, a voluntary exchange governed by comparative advantage, price signals, and efficiency. Politics may distort it at the margins, but underlying assumptions is continuity, that trade flows unless disrupted by extraordinary force. India's decision to ban all imports originating from or transiting through Pakistan represents a deliberate rejection of that assumption. This was not an impulsive reaction to a single incident, nor was it an attempt to extract short-term economic advantage. It was a demonstration of how trade in the contemporary world has been ceased to be a neutral process and has instead become a controllable system, one that can be switched off legally, quietly, and asymmetrically. What makes this decision significant is not the volume of trade affected. By the time the ban was imposed, India-Pakistan trade was already negligible. Imports from Pakistan had fallen to a few $100,000 annually, an amount irrelevant to an economy of India's scale. If trade volumes were the metric, the move would appear redundant. Yet this interpretation misses the core logic entirely. Power is not exercised where resistance is strong, it is exercised where precedent can be established at lower costs. The import ban was not designed to hurt India's economy or even to cause immediate visible pain to Pakistan's. It was designed to formalize a principle that access to India's market is conditional, revocable, and subordinate to national security. The mechanism through which this was done matters as much as the decision itself. India didn't rely on executive discretion or temporary emergency orders. Instead, it amended its foreign trade policy, embedding the prohibition directly into the legal architecture of governing imports. By doing so, the state transformed what might have been perceived as a political gesture into a structural feature of policy. Law has inertia. Once a restriction is codified in a formal policy framework, reversal becomes politically costly, administratively complex, and symbolically insignificant. Trade, in effect, was reclassified from a default right into a permissioned activity requiring an explicit state approval in exceptional cases. The invocation of national security and public policy as the justification for the ban is central to understanding its durability. These terms are not rhetorical flourishes. They are the strongest legal shields available in international economic governance. Under World Trade Organization rules and broader multilateral norms, national security exceptions occupy a privileged and largely non-justiciable space. By framing the ban with this domain, India insulated itself from meaningful external challenge. The decision was placed beyond routine trade disputes and redefined as sovereign act tied to security, not commerce. In doing so, India effectively signaled that economic engagement itself can be withdrawn as a security response, without the need for sanction regimes, coalition building, or overt escalation. The nature of the goods affected by the ban further underscores its strategic intent. The items historically imported from Pakistan were not high profile consumer products but upstream inputs. Cotton yarn, raw hides, salt, minerals, agricultural produce, these are components embedded deep into supply chains, not objects of public attention. Disrupting such goods doesn't create immediate shortages that provoke popular backlash. Instead, it introduces friction into production process, raises costs incrementally, forces inefficient rerouting through third countries. This form of pressure is subtle and delayed, but it compounds over time. It is the economic equivalent of constructing arteries rather than striking limbs. Less dramatic but far more devastating in the long run. Equally important is what the ban communicated to actors beyond Pakistan. In a globalized trading system, bilateral prohibitions rarely remain bilateral in their effects. Re export hubs, logistics firms, insurers, financiers, and multinational compliance departments all take note when a major economy hardens its trade posture under a security rationale. The message transmitted was not simply that India would not trade with Pakistan any longer, but any attempt to intermediate, disguise, or normalize such trade through indirect routes would carry risks. Once uncertainty is introduced into compliance calculations, private actors begin to self-regulate. This is one of the most effective forms of power available to modern state, shaping behavior through enforcement alone, but not through enforcement alone, but through the anticipation of enforcement. The financial dimensions of the decision reinforces this interpretation. India's parallel efforts to question or revive international financial support to Pakistan, particularly through multilateral institutions, created a reinforcing loop between trade restrictions and financial credibility. Institutions such as the IMF or the International Monetary Fund are acutely sensitive to external stability, policy coherence, and geopolitical risks. By tightening Pakistan's trade channels while highlighting security instability, India increased the perceived risk profile of the Pakistani state without directly controlling the institutions themselves. This is influence exercised through narrative, context rather than command, a hallmark of sophisticated power in a rule-based system. The contrast between India's approach and Pakistan's response further illuminates the asymmetry at work. Pakistan's retaliatory, retaliatory measures, airspace closures, diplomatic expulsions, public warnings were overt and expressive. They communicated anger and resistance. They didn't alter the underlying system in which two countries operate. India's measures, by contrast, were administrative, legal, and understated. There was no need for dramatic announcement or constant reiteration. Once the policy was amended, the system enforced itself. The difference is crucial. Expressive power seeks recognition, structural power seeks compliance. The latter is quieter, but it lasts longer. Political leadership played a role not through detailed exposition but through calibrated ambiguity. Statements by Narendra Modi emphasizing punishment and resolve were deliberately non-specific. This lacks this lack of precision was not a weakness, it was strategic choice. By avoiding clear lines or enumerated consequences, India preserved escalation flexibility while compelling adversaries to plan for worst-case scenarios. Ambiguity in this context functioned as a deterrent. It left open the possibility that further economic, diplomatic, or legal measures could follow without committing the state to a particular course of action. At a deeper level, the import bans reflects a broader transformation in how states conceptualize sovereignty in an interconnected world. For decades, globalization was framed as a process that diluted national control in favor of market integration. What India's decision illustrates is that the reversal of that logic. Integration has not eliminated sovereignty, it has multiplied the levers through which sovereignty can be exercised. Trade agreements, supply chains, financial networks, regulatory regimes are not constraints on power, they are instruments of it, provided a state has the capacity and confidence to use them. This shift has implications far beyond the India Pakistan relationship, but normalizing the idea that trade access can be withdrawn on security grounds, even in the absence of formal sanctions or armed conflict, India has contributed to a broader global trend in which economic independence is increasingly weaponized. Other states observe and learn. Precedents accumulate over time, the threshold for economic exclusion lowers, the distinction between commerce and coercion blurs. This doesn't necessarily lead to constant disruption, but it does change the baseline assumption under which global trade operates. Ultimately, the significance of India's import bans lies not in what it stopped, but in what it demonstrated. It showed that modern power doesn't require spectacle. It doesn't require tanks crossing borders or dramatic declarations of war. It requires the ability to identify critical systems, embedded authority within legal frameworks, and withdraw access in a way that appears procedural rather than aggressive. The most effective acts of statecraft today are those that feel administrative to outsiders but existential to those affected. In this sense, the ban is best understood not as a trade measure, but as a lesson in control. Trade continues elsewhere, ships still move, markets still function, and for those excluded, the system has closed. Reopening it requires political change rather than economic negotiation. That asymmetry, where one side treats access as a privilege and the other experiences its absence as a constraint, it is essential for power in the 21st century. It is the essence of power in the 21st century. Power, as this episode makes clear, is not the ability to destroy systems loudly. It is the ability to close them quietly and let the world adjust around that closure.